I'm back with Suzi Collins. This is Justin Poulin, and we are continuing the Power Supply video series highlighting key topics of interest, I would say, to the supply chain community out there working in healthcare. And Suzi, today's topic is going to be wage disparity. And I will say this is one of those taboo type of topics. So, I don't think we'll ruffle any feathers. I think everybody out there, whether they're leadership or front lines, knows that there's some serious disparity, and retention is the biggest issue. We've talked a lot on the podcast and in other interviews about recruitment, and maybe we'll save that one for another conversation. And how do we find and bring new talent into healthcare who really understand that the mission is very different than it is in other industries in a supply chain career. But today, it's about keeping that talent. And a lot of it is career ladder. Maybe we know that they're not going to come in at a starting wage that's as competitive as other industries, but can we give them upward mobility so that the earning potential is there? So let's set the table a little bit, Suzi. I've talked enough setting it up here. What about wage what is it about wage disparity that makes that conversation a little taboo the most? Let's start there.
Well, I think the big part of it is honestly, we all know that the higher salaries in a hospital are going to be your nurses, respiratory therapy, those truly clinical facing positions. And there's only so much staffing budget. And unfortunately, many of the ancillary positions, not just supply chain, have a tendency to be a lower scale in comparison to those same positions in different industries, right? So you can have an inventory person in a hospital. You can also have an inventory person working at Amazon. So it's well known, if you will, that we are not always competitive compared to other industries. And I think part of that is honestly that we're competing internally with the clinical positions.
Yeah, and it's tough financial times. So I think that's another reason that this could be taboo right now, is that the bottom lines have always been lean, but they're suffering and have been suffering for several years now. You and I have talked about in past videos that the skill set coming into an entry-level position in healthcare supply chain, typically materials management, that we need more skills and maybe not experience, although experience definitely helps, but entry level insinuates that there won't be experience. But we need a higher level skill set than we used to in the past. The demands on that job and the critical thinking that are required have changed the landscape significantly. As you start thinking about wage disparity, career ladder, I'm wondering if there is maybe a return on investment finally, because I feel like we could get away with not having that skill set, but I think healthcare organizations are going to suffer now, and that ultimately that means lost savings opportunities, inefficient operations that mean we're not tracking areas where we're losing dollars. Expired inventory could be one of those if people don't really know don't have the tools and technology to be able to manage that. That's just one area. Right. Do you think that this is difficult to look at and say, hey, we're losing these dollars by not having a more competitive wage?
Yeah, I definitely think about it. In whether you call it, we call them a distribution tech, inventory clerk, some people call them materials handlers. There's all kinds of ways to discuss that person. But when you think about what they're doing, they're going into a clinical setting because they're in the supply room. They're looking at what's in the bin, making a determination of what they should be bringing the clinician. So one, if somebody doesn't care, they could be overstocking, right? And then you just have dollars sitting in a bin and expiring. But two, you also need to be conscientious of what's important to be there. So if they kind of take a pause that day and they don't bring them enough IV solution, they may have to call a house soup in the middle of the night to get IV fluid. So what we're asking them to do directly impacts clinical care. And I think that that is something that we need to be more cognizant of when we're deciding on the salary range, because the lower that salary range begins, one, you're going to get somebody maybe with no skills and no real critical thinking skills, or you're going to get somebody in there and they might be really good, and then you're going to lose them within a year. And that's the part that's just, how do we fix that? And then, like you're talking about with that career ladder, go from a regular tech to a lead tech to then receiving, because receiving is an extremely important job. And then maybe that person moves on to become a materials coordinator, a buyer, a supervisor. So I think there's a really fantastic career ladder within this setting, but if we never fix the salaries and we never align the importance across all hospitals, how do we fight the battle?
Yeah. I also think if you're talking about that 1 year, right? They come in, they work for a year, and then you lose them. Most employees are not really functioning at an optimum level until at least 90 days. And typically it's going to be 6 months. Right. The cost of turnover, to just to go through the hiring process and everything else, I'd say minimally is every time you lose somebody, it's costing you $40,000 to replace them.
Right.
And so, I would think that partnering with human resources and looking at retention and what are the tenure rates and how much turnover do you have, and then trying to apply some sort of a calculation on that to right size it. Maybe it's you get a bonus if you stay that certain period of time. So you're actually saying to the employee, we want you to stay here, but it costs a lot to turnover. So if you don't stay, we see that a lot in clinical work, because the challenge is the same. Even if the wage is not so disparate, the conversation is the same. If you hire a nurse and they only stay a year and then they leave, you're still paying a lot to recruit, replace, and you see those signing bonuses, but the signing bonus doesn't pay until they've been there a certain time. Feel like we need to get a little bit more creative with that. The other thing is, I think we've accepted turnover and I would say in other non-revenue generating departments within the hospital, not just limited to supply chain. We just accept that turnover is sort of part of the job. And I don't think that we can, especially when we're not investing in advanced technologies and integrations that help take our operations and make it automated to an extent that we're not going to forget how to do the job. And the problem with the turnover is somebody forgets how to do the job. The leader has to come in and teach them again. And this is going to tee up our next video series, which will be on leadership burnout. This is a major factor with that. But I feel like just throwing bodies at it, sometimes it's this, at this wage, we're better off accepting the turnover and we just throw bodies at it. So then begs the next question. Is there enough experience out there to pare down the size of our supply chain teams, but build up the experience and retention level by having higher wages? Or are we accepting that there's just always going to be turnover, that the experience isn't out there, and so we just want to have more staff versus less, more efficient staff being paid more? Because I feel like that's really the two ends of the spectrum, and you're trying to find the balance there as an organization.
Yeah, I think, there's talent out there. We all know that there's a percentage of the population that isn't necessarily going to go to college, right? They're not necessarily that person who's going to choose to have a degree and work in an office and be in that setting. So I think two things are important. We've had a lot of discussions within ARM of how do we educate either at the high school level or even like a technical school level, where maybe we end up with a certification for a distribution tech, a buyer, a receiving clerk, do actually education or certification around it. But the other thing is, if you get them in and we're not paying a competitive salary, when you talk about turnover, there are places that I know and I used to, work where I almost always had a posting for that position. It was literally a revolving door.
You just expected to have a shortfall in staff levels.
Yes. And even we've done per diem, so that, to have a backup. So it's very important that we identify what are the things that can actually save money, create an ROI, build the positions around it, build the expectations of these folks around it, give them a sense of purpose, and keep them in our organization longer. And I think that's something that we're going to look at even within our own local chapter, because, the reality for us here in Phoenix, there's a lot of hospitals to choose from. So the last thing I want to be doing is teaching somebody and have them go to another system. So we need to have conversations about it. It needs to be something that's more discussed, if you will, publicly, like what we're doing.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, it's one thing to lose somebody from your team because you don't have an opening for upward mobility and there is one in another organization. It's another thing to lose a staff person because of wage disparity and they're making a lateral move. And then it's a whole other thing that the stress of the job leads them to go outside of the industry, to like an Amazon, or even a Home Depot. I mean, Home Depot and McDonald's are competitive at these wages right now. And that makes it very daunting, especially if, the stress of, being in healthcare supply chain. Some people thrive knowing that they're impacting the outcomes of, the patient care. But some people really get uncomfortable with that, especially when they're not working, in ideal circumstances. And so, there's some vetting there about who you really want to retain and, whether they're a good fit or not. But that's different than the wage disparity piece. As we're wrapping up, what am I missing in this conversation about wage disparity that just has to be said?
Well, I think the other really important piece of it is we need the HR departments to realize that we are part of the clinical process. And I think that's the part where I know I personally will fight for my starting salary of a new employee. I will comb their resume for anything I can get, ask them detailed questions so that I can go back to HR and get them the best possible salary that I can, knowing, because here's the other thing, whatever that starting salary is, that 3 to 5% increase every year is going to be less unless they've started at a great salary. So having that conversation, making them realize, the other thing, code cards, think about it. The code card is the most important tool when a patient is crashing. If our distribution techs are the ones that are turning those code cards around and ensuring that the supplies, the life-saving supplies, are in that code card, how important is that? It's not just important, it's critical. It is, again, a life-saving tool. So I think we need to get folks to realize that we really are truly part of the clinical process.
Yeah. It's an emergent life-saving tool. When you go into a surgical procedure, it's planned, et cetera. And so if you've got a delay or pivot, maybe, it's just a case delay, that's one thing.
Right.
There is no such thing as a case delay when a patient codes and begins to crash. And so that is a fantastic point that you're making there. And, at the end of the day, I think that HR piece is so critical, is, increasing that awareness, but also getting credit for relevant or relatable experience, because how many people come into these roles with a business degree, maybe a logistics degree, maybe they have a healthcare administration degree. We have people that aren't necessarily experienced in healthcare, supply chain, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't receive credit for the experience that they do have. They're not all coming from college. And so if they worked in any relatable, anything that really understands supply and distribution from any level or understands healthcare, we have to translate that to human resources to help give them a boost, because that experience is valuable somewhere else. And 100%. We don't necessarily have the luxury of getting a feeder program from a local college or university that's just sending us interns that are just running out of school ready to go. So we have to be more creative than that and make that case. This is going to wrap up this video, but I will say we've got another one. I think we need to really drill in a little bit and talk about maybe some tools or recommendations or best practices for working with human resources to make this case and others.
I think we could have a whole nother discussion about that.
It could be a series.
Absolutely.
And maybe we reach out to somebody who works in human resources to get sort of, a lot of times it's even like when you're trying to present information to the C-level for the first few times, until you understand how they think and what's important to them, you may be sharing really great information, but not in a way that's able to make it received and really land the way you need it to make a change. So all that and more. If you aren't watching Suzi's TikTok videos, make sure you're following her. And she's also got her own content going out on LinkedIn. You're doing a great job. I think you've inspired some others though too. I've seen many people more posting on social media about healthcare supply chains. So let's keep it going. Let's keep that conversation happening. Thank you everybody for watching the video series. And Suzi, great job.
See you soon. Bye-bye.